Good evening. All right, there we go. Let's try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, good to see everybody.
We didn't know we had to respond.
We're a very responsive city, you know that.
Right.
My name is Wendell Pritchett. I'm the Chancellor at Rutgers University-Camden, right across the river, and also a professor of law and history. And it's really my honor and pleasure to be with you this evening and to share a little time with Todd Purdum. Todd is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and a senior writer at Politico, a former journalist at the New York Times who's written a wonderful book, An Idea Whose Time Has Come, Two Presidents, Two Parties, and the Battle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Todd, it's really a pleasure
Thanks
to
to
be
be
with
here, Wendell. It's really my pleasure.
So Todd and I are going to talk for a little while, and then there's lots of opportunity for audience questions, and I think you already have some note cards that have been passed around in case you want to ask a question. So Todd, this is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so that's a reason in itself to write this book. But I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about your personal journey to writing this book. There must have been other things that drew you particular to this story.
Well, it's interesting. I've had occasion to think about that this week because people have asked me that question more than once. And I have an editor at Vanity Fair, a wonderful man named Cullen Murphy, who for many years was the managing editor of the Atlantic Monthly. And he's been after me to write a book, and to write a book that would be somewhat manageable, a story that wouldn't be a 10-year project, but maybe take 3 years or so. And about 3.5 years ago, he reminded me that the anniversary was coming up. And he said, you know, I think you ought to take a look at it because this story is always a chapter or a section in somebody else's book. It's not a book of its own. And I did a little bit of preliminary research, and I was absolutely fascinated to find all sorts of things I didn't know about how the bill actually got passed, including with what overwhelming bipartisan support it had passed. And I was embarrassed to realize that I was not sentient, really, but I mean, I was alive during the passage of that bill. And moreover, in the winter of 1964, I grew up in Illinois, my family had taken a car trip, a vacation at spring break to Florida. And I'm quite sure that when we went back in the winter of 1965, the experience must have been very different, but I was completely oblivious to whatever that difference was. So I thought I owed it to myself and to my own children to find more about it. I'd grown up in Illinois. I knew of Senator Dirksen. I knew of his role. Someplace I've lost it, but there's a baby picture of me autographed by Senator Dirksen. He was a friend of my grandfather's. And so anyway, but the more I began to do research, I realized what a rich and incredible story this is with really wonderful personalities of both races and both parties, some of whom are sadly not as well remembered as they should be. And so that was the satisfying part for me, was digging into that story.
Excellent, excellent. And it's a wonderful book, and it really is rich with all those stories. Like you just said, there's so many people that aren't remembered. I want to get to them in a second, but to kind of set up that conversation, you know, the battle for civil rights is centuries old and ongoing, and will not be done ever, probably. Could you tell us a little bit about what you see as the major issues in the early 60s that the Civil Rights Act was trying to deal with, that advocates and legislators were talking about as the major things?
Well, the basic reality was that 100 years after the Civil War, the Civil War's promise had remained unfulfilled. And equality in the eyes of the law was not a reality in large parts of the country. And it was very awkward for John Kennedy, even as the 61, 62 began to go on, there were all sorts of commemorations of the 100th anniversary of this act, just of the Civil War, the 100th anniversary of that. And when it came around for the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, he was very stymied as to what to do because he didn't want to ignore it, but he didn't want to make too big a deal about it either because it was all too clear that the promise of emancipation had not really been vindicated. So, of course, what had happened by 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled in the Brown case. And people forget that all deliberate speed didn't mean quick, it meant slow. Deliberate was a word to slow. And, but of course it was being not honored in large parts of the country, and it had not addressed the question of segregation in public accommodations, lunch counters, hotels, and so on. And it began to seem, partly to a generation of African Americans who had served, for example, in World War II, been in Europe and other places where they didn't experience that kind of Jim Crow discrimination. 18 years later, it began to seem just completely untenable. And of course, then in the spring of 1963, all the demonstrations culminated. It started with the Freedom Rides in 1961, the integration of Ole Miss, which turned into a horrible riot. And in the spring of 1963, Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and the other SCLC demonstrators had those incredible days in Birmingham where Bull Connors fire hoses and police dogs were turned on young people and children, knocked them to the streets. And the world was outraged, and President Kennedy was outraged too, in part because he realized it was a horrible international black eye for the country in the Cold War. And so finally, after years of equivocation, he was moved to propose a comprehensive bill.
Yeah. And it really was comprehensive. So public accommodations
Yep.
was one of the major issues, the fact that throughout the South, African Americans and other minorities just couldn't stay a night at a hotel, eat at a restaurant, all of those kinds of things. So that was one part. Discrimination in the workforce, in the
Yes.
workplace.
Although his initial proposals in that regard were considered to be very weak and quite disappointing to the civil rights community. They didn't have really any enforcement teeth. It would involve federal contractors, not really the private sector.
Yeah, at the beginning of
beginning.
talk about voting rights, I mean, there's some
Yes, there's
there.
some, and not an abolition of literacy tests, but an insistence that they all be the same. But the bill did not apply to state and local elections. It only applied initially to federal elections. A provision to cut off funds to state and local programs that received federal money that were discriminating. That was very controversial for some people. Yeah. And then making permanent the Civil Rights Commission, which had first been created by the 1957 Civil Rights Act, and establishing some other agencies of community relations service to help mediate disputes. Those were the principal things. But the real heart and soul of the bill was the public accommodations section. It was both practical and symbolic. It affected every aspect of the daily lives of African Americans. And you know, I didn't realize, for example, that Martin Luther King himself had had to spend his honeymoon with Coretta in the only place available to them in the rural area where they got married, which was the extra bedroom of a black funeral parlor.
Yeah, it really is striking, only 50 years ago. Before we talk about some of the unsung heroes, you have a great vignette. You had mentioned about the Emancipation Proclamation. And could you tell everybody where President Kennedy was when it was
Well, on the
celebrated?
day that they had a commemoration at the Lincoln Memorial of the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in the fall of 1962, President Kennedy actually was at the America's Cup races off Newport watching the races. And on board his vessel was one young Yale student named John Kerry. And so he was there, and he sent a tape recording. But Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York came in person, and because, of course, to the degree that civil rights was a real political issue for either party in the 20th century, it was a Republican issue. Yeah. And Governor Rockefeller not only came and spoke, but he brought with him one of the New York State Archives' most precious possessions, the draft of the proclamation in Abraham Lincoln's own hand. And Kennedy was incensed, and he was very worried about Rockefeller as a potential opponent in 1964. So when Lincoln's birthday rolled around in February of 1963, he decided that they would have a big reception for about 800 African Americans at the White House, the largest gathering ever under the president's roof to that point. But he was incensed to find that his friend Sammy Davis had brought his white wife, the Swedish actress May-Britt, and he was so mad that he wanted to make sure there were no pictures of them at all. And he asked Mrs. Kennedy to pull them aside, and she was so mad at that request that she left the party in tears. So it got a lot of attention in the black press, was almost completely ignored in the white press. And there's a marvelous picture of them all sort of sitting awkwardly in a settee in the diplomatic reception room trying to put the best face on this occasion.
Wow. And President Kennedy had made a conscious decision with regard to the Emancipation Proclamation not to be there for that day.
Yes,
right? I mean, it was
yes,
a conscious
yes.
decision because he was uncomfortable
About what to
towards that
do.
reality. Yeah.
And he knew that people would ask him, so what are you going to do about it? And he didn't want to have to answer.
Yeah, amazing. So I hope we can come back to President Kennedy and obviously talk a lot about President Johnson. But as you point out so often in the book, there's so many other people, interesting people who played a role in this. And there's so many of them. I know you can't talk about all of them, but could you tell us about at least a few of them?
Well, I guess I'd single out certainly two. One is Clarence Mitchell, who was the longtime chief lobbyist for the NAACP in Washington, African-American, who went to Knight Law School, had gotten his law degree pretty shortly before the whole civil rights debate came up with the bill. He was such a persistent presence on Capitol Hill that he was known as the 101st Senator at a time when only 5 members of Congress were black. He'd been born in Baltimore, grew up there, continued to live there and commute to Washington every day. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke. He refused to walk into the crosswalk until the light had turned green because he didn't want to do anything that would get him in trouble. And he was just incredibly brave and diligent and patient. And he went out of his way to establish relationships with even the most hardcore segregationists. And in fact, on the day that the cloture was voted in the Senate and the filibuster was broken, he walked the leader of the filibuster, Dick Russell of Georgia, back to his office just as a gesture of courtly gentlemanship. And it's hard to imagine something like that happening today. The other unsung hero who it's impossible not to admire is a conservative Republican congressman from Ohio named William McCulloch, whose hometown of Piqua, Ohio, in the west central part of the state near Dayton, is today represented by John Boehner. And McCulloch was the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee in the House, and he opposed gun control, opposed federal aid to education, but he had been descended from abolitionists, and he was a die-hard supporter of civil rights. And in the summer of 1963, just as President Kennedy had proposed the bill, McCulloch made a deal with the Kennedy Justice Department in the White House that if they would promise not to water it down in the Senate, as had happened in 1957 and 1960, if they promised to give the Republicans equal credit, he would use his clout with his caucus to bring the Republican members of the House along and pass the bill. And of course that was absolutely necessary because the Democrats were split and the Southerners were opposed to the bill. And it had the effect of forcing first the Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration to attempt something that had never before succeeded, which was to break a filibuster on civil rights in the Senate. So this one man, and people as in the know as Nick Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis herself are on record as saying they thought that at the end of the day he was probably the single most important force in getting the actual legislation passed. I mean, it has 1,000 fathers, this legislation, and fathers and mothers. And someone told me the other day that they'd been discussing this question with one of President Johnson's daughters, I forget whether it was Linda or Lucy, and that she had asked him at the time the bill was passed why he'd given so many pens to Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, the Senate Republican leader, when Dr. King was responsible for getting the bill passed. And President Johnson supposedly said to her, sweetie, Dr. King passed the bill, but Senator Dirksen made the law. And it's a really interesting distinction, but I think there's credit to go around, and it's just nice to give it to some of the people who've been a little bit forgotten.
Yeah, wonderful. Could you talk up for a couple of minutes about this interesting question for us today about the breakdown of opinion on civil rights among the legislators? So as you pointed out, in fact, this was a Republican issue in a lot of ways, but this was a period of change.
It was a period of change, and in the aftermath of the passage of the law, President Johnson worried that he had given the South to the Republicans for a generation, and the Republicans over that period went gradually but steadily from being the party of Lincoln to the party of white backlash, and it's frankly, there are still Southern Democrats in Congress, they're just Republicans now. Yeah. And the Republicans faced problems with that as a national brand, as we saw in 2008 and 2012. In fact, in 2004, the Republican nominee very nearly lost. I mean, the Republican, incumbent very nearly lost. And so all the things that helped the Republicans in this midterm year, in their individual districts, where the big worry is getting a primary from the Tea Party or the right, hurt them at the national level. Yeah. And in some real way, in the past 50 years, the two parties have exactly flipped their roles, not only on race and civil rights, but on a whole host of other things.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, not only President Johnson thought about this, but President Kennedy did too. I think one of the many virtues of this book, you really captured President Kennedy's ambivalence, both, not morally, that's not accurate, but the uncertainty about how much progress could be made in civil rights, and then also his political concerns. So could you talk us a little bit about President Kennedy?
Well, I think it's very interesting. It's indisputable that he temporized on civil rights for a long time and that he came slowly to the cause. One of the things I set out to find, and I have to give credit to a wonderful journalist, a British journalist named Nick Bryant, who wrote a book about President Kennedy and civil rights called The Bystander. But I was trying to get at the question of how many black people, or what kinds of black people, had John Kennedy ever known before he became president? And the answer was his two valets. And he didn't really have any exposure. In the 1960 campaign, a black dentist in San Francisco asked him how many black professionals he knew, and he said he didn't know more than 5 that he could call by their first name, but he was promising to try to get better about it. So I think one of the moving things that actually did happen to him in those crowded first 2 years of his administration was he had an unbelievably fast education on the topic. And by the time he finally proposed the bill, I wouldn't say he was radicalized, but he was very much made aware of how unfair the situation was, just how insidious discrimination was in the South, just what a lot ordinary black people had to bear in life. And when he made the speech proposing the bill, he decided to do it on such short notice that the text was not even finished. And he went on the air. Could you imagine the president going on live television with one of the most important speeches of his entire presidency, and it isn't finished? So for about the last 2.5 minutes, he ad-libs, and you can tell he's ad-libbing because he circles back to some points he's made before. But the advantage of that, and he was such a, as we know, commanding, presence, is that he spoke extemporaneously and clearly not just off the cuff, but from the heart, and saying things like, this just seems to be an elemental right to me. And it was conversational, and it had the effect of, I think, being in some ways even more powerful. He did another thing too. His speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, had some strong language, like saying things like, cesspools of segregation exist all over the country. Kennedy changed it to areas. And Sorensen said, a revolution is at hand. And Kennedy said, a great change is at hand. And it was a wonderful lesson for me as a writer in what a good editor can do. And in this case, the editor was the president himself.
Yeah, so interesting. And of course, his transformation was facilitated by people like Bull Connor. And the events that everybody was seeing at that time.
Exactly.
It was pretty hard not to take a position, given what you talk about
Exactly.
and most people know about.
And he shocked the civil rights leaders who were meeting with him one day in the White House when he said, I don't think you all should be so harsh on Bull Connor. And Arthur Schlesinger records that there was a sharp intake of breath until he said, after all, he's done more for civil rights than anyone. And they then relaxed.
So you also capture, in a lot of different ways, the complexity of Lyndon Johnson, another flawed person, but also contributed greatly to progress, certainly in this area. So tell us a little bit about how he approached this question, and then also if you talk to us about what he did actually in trying to get this bill passed.
Well, you know, in popular myth, the bill has come to be seen as the result of Dr. King's demonstrations, Kennedy's assassination and moral vision, and Johnson's legislative skill. And certainly Johnson brought to bear his tremendous knowledge of how the Senate worked. He did lobby some members to vote for cloture and bring the debate to a close. But I think it's also the most important thing to remember is how careful he was not to be too heavy-handed, because he knew it could backfire. Early in his vice presidency, he had tried to win the right to continue to preside over the Senate Democratic caucus, and his former colleagues had resoundingly rejected that idea, and he was humiliated by it. So you can tell from the secret White House tapes that both he and President Kennedy made that he's going nuts about the pace that the Senate debate is taking under the leadership of the Majority Leader Mike Mansfield and the Democratic floor leader on the bill, Hubert Humphrey. And he wants them to go hold round-the-clock sessions and make the Senate come in its pajamas. And they think that's impractical. And their strategy is if they let the Southerners talk themselves to death, let them exhaust all their arguments, the whole energy of the debate will eventually change, and it'll swing back around, and the pro-civil rights forces will have the advantage. So I think President Johnson deserves all the credit he gets, but he deserves it because he held himself and his tremendous impulsiveness and his tremendous ego in check, and he never wavered from saying we have to pass the strongest possible bill, the bill that was pending in the House at the time of the president's death. We're not going to wheel and deal. We're not going to compromise. We're not going to do all the things I'm known for. We're going to pass the strong bill.
Yeah. And of course, the core of the book is the legislative process from introduction of the bill to its passage. And there are just so many wonderful vignettes and aspects of that process that you describe. And it's a pretty tortuous process. And in the future, I want to ask you about how you compare it to today. But first, let's talk about the process.
Well, at any one point, so many things could have gone wrong. First, in the House Judiciary Committee, where the civil rights groups and the most liberal members of the Democratic Party were trying to load the bill up. They were so relieved to finally have an actual bill that they loaded it up with a lot of provisions. For example, they wanted to make it apply to state and local elections. They wanted to have strong employment discrimination measures. That cooler head said, oh, this can't pass the full House, much less pass the Senate. So one of the last things John Kennedy did in terms of legislative negotiations was to very adroitly, and in contrast to his reputation as not being a very good legislative draftsman or craftsman, he really reined that back in and managed to get the committee to pass a bill that was strong and had teeth in it and would be enforceable, but that wouldn't be such a Christmas tree of things that it would all fall apart. So that's one thing in the process. Then when the bill got to the House floor, the challenge was not to keep it from being too strong, it was to keep it from being weakened by amendments on the floor. And because the House in those days conducted legislative debate in what's known as the Committee of the Whole, votes weren't recorded by and large. And the only way you could know how someone was voting was to be there physically and watch. And except for reporters, no one could take notes on paper in the House gallery. So the pro-civil rights forces, led by Clarence Mitchell and others, had to devise a system of gallery watchers. The segregationists called them vultures. But they had to sit there and keep notes in their head of who was voting how on what amendment. And in the pre-beeper era, pre-cell phone era, they had to figure out a way to round up friendly members to make sure enough were on the floor at any one time to defeat hostile legislative mischief. So a bunch of young activists, led by a woman who was working for the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union named Jane O'Grady, who's still alive and still fighting all the fights, would sit in friendly members' offices with a kind of a telephone tree, and when they heard that something was happening on the floor, they'd go running, physically running from office to office and say, come on, come on, come on. And after about 3 days of this, the members were so exhausted, they said, you don't have to come. I'm coming, believe me, I'm coming. And she felt so guilty when the whole thing was over that she stayed up all night baking chocolate cookies, vanilla sugar cookies with chocolate icing equal signs, and taking them around to all the members who'd been so faithful.
Could I ask you a follow-up on that? So is it accurate to say that this was maybe one of the first modern lobbying efforts in that way, grassroots modern lobbying?
I think in that way it was very much one of the first grassroots lobbying efforts, and a crucial part that I didn't talk about yet is the groundswell of religious interfaith support for the bill across all denominations, and it was applied not willy-nilly but in a targeted way. The northern and eastern Democrats knew that labor unions could play a role because politicians in those states were motivated by things like organized labor. But in the Midwest and Plain states, Republicans disproportionately, those movements didn't have the same, in fact, could have backfired. But those members had no large black constituencies, but they had a lot of Methodists and Presbyterians and Catholics and Baptists. And the church groups, led by the National Council of Churches and others, created a very deliberate strategy to lobby those senators one by one, and day after day, with their law school classmates from Notre Dame, or the bishops in their local area. Carl Munt of South Dakota was overheard muttering in the cloakroom one day after he'd taken a vote to procedurally support the bill. I hope that satisfies those 2 damn bishops who called me last night. And he was even a little saltier than that. And that was a remarkable application of strategic lobbying that in some ways continued the next year with the Voting Rights Act. We haven't seen it again. We tend to think of religious activism in politics as being the religious right. This was, if you will, the last full flowering of the religious left.
Yeah. So take us to the Senate, where there are lots of interesting characters too, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about Senator Dirksen, who you knew.
Yeah, well, Senator Dirksen is irresistible. He was known as the Wizard of Ooze. He had a magnificent, mellifluous voice, which he kept in shape by gargling every day with Pond's cold cream and water, which he swallowed. The rest of his diet was mostly cigarettes, Maalox, and bourbon. And he once described the lubricating properties of distilled spirits by saying that his wife, Mrs. Dirksen's, quote, favorite vegetable is champagne, while I prefer a fellow by the name of Jonathan Daniels. And he kept a clock in his office in the back room where a lot of the negotiations took place, and every hour was marked 5. So it was always perfectly appropriate time for a drink. And Nicholas Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General, told me that the challenge in negotiating with Senator Dirksen, especially in the evening, was to get his agreement on any amendments before so much bourbon had been consumed that he wouldn't remember the next morning what he'd agreed to the night before, because while legislative language could be redrafted once without changing its meaning, to do it a second time was much harder. So that was one colorful character.
But he comes along.
He comes along, and his interest was, from the very beginning, he said, I'm for this except for public accommodations and employment discrimination, which is really the heart of the bill. But his concern was several things. One, he resented very deeply that he did not get more credit with black voters in Illinois and Chicago in particular for having a pretty decent civil rights record. He was conservative in other ways, but he really did have a pretty decent, he was always against the poll tax, lynching, way back in the 30s when he was a freshman member of Congress. Second thing is, his home state of Illinois already had strong anti-discrimination statutes on the books, both public accommodations and employment discrimination. And as a good Midwestern conservative, he did not want a second layer of federal bureaucracy coming in and pestering Illinois businessmen to have 2 sets of records, 2 sets of books, one for the state law, one for the federal. So the compromise, he'd made hundreds of little picayune changes in language to say that he'd had a long list of changes. But the big change he made was giving states that had their own effective anti-discrimination laws first crack at enforcement before the federal government would come in. And the Southerners correctly surmised that this would have the effect of making the law focus almost completely on legal segregation in the South, not de facto segregation in a city like Philadelphia or Chicago. And they also saw it for what it was, which was a deliberate effort to round up support from his fellow Midwesterners for the bill. But it worked, and he did it.
Very interesting. So I asked you, as a political reporter, to do at least some contrasting between our period now, which we talk about gridlock and how difficult it is to get anything done, and 1964 that you wrote so well about. I have to say, though, I mean, the process was not pretty in 1964 either.
It wasn't pretty, but I think one advantage was it wasn't so visible either. And I know it sounds strange as a journalist to say this, but this story is a great testament to the uses of secrecy. A lot of these negotiations happen behind closed doors, and because in the Senate, the Judiciary Committee, led by Jim Eastland of Mississippi, refused to consider the bill, basically, or refused to take it seriously, they had to create a kind of ad hoc committee made up of Justice Department lawyers, friendly senators, interest groups, who could, behind closed doors, hammer out a compromise. And the interesting thing is, several people who participated in those sessions, and most of them were in their late 20s or early 30s, and the ones who are still alive, a glow comes in their eyes when they talk about it. They clearly remember it as the highlight of their lives to be part of these. Even then, clearly they knew it was a momentous negotiation. But people could test their assumptions and throw out a trial balloon without having to have a chart for C-SPAN or go on the evening news or repeat the tired old talking points to satisfy the base in a fundraising letter. And I think there's a lot to be said for the smoke-filled room or the alcohol-fueled room. But that was one part that I definitely contrasted to today.
Maybe also we should go back to reporters have to write things down. They can only be there live, and they have to write things down.
It's always better to see it yourself, you know. So.
Very good. I think we're going to have some questions. So as we pull over the questions that the audience had, Todd, you want to tell the audience the story you were just telling me before we came out here about Roger Ailes? I thought it's appropriate.
Oh,
considering that we're about to have
so
questions.
Wendell, on the occasion of the recent death of Joe McGinnis, the journalist who got his big start in Philadelphia and wrote about the selling of the president in the 1968 Nixon campaign, then candidate Nixon had these series of town halls which were taped for television, and they were then shown on the air as a kind of Nixon meeting the voters and the people. But Ailes described how the process would work, which is that the audience members would fill out their question cards. They'd come to the team of the campaign. They'd be totally rewritten with the campaign's own questions and passed on to Nixon, who'd answer just the questions that his staff wanted him to answer, but they looked like they were all coming from the audience. But it was so these are really yours.
So I promise not to do that. I might put them in a certain order, but I promise not to edit them. So one of the questions that we have, Todd, is would the Civil Rights Act have passed if Nixon had won in 1960 and in 64?
I think it probably would have, because, you know, in 1957, when the Civil Rights Act was pending on the Senate floor, and LBJ scaled it back and compromised and dropped entirely this provision that would have allowed the Attorney General from being sued, and then compromised on the jury trial provision allowing effectively all white juries to hear these cases in the South, Nixon was in tears, and he was distraught, and he was very close to Clarence Mitchell. He was very close to a lot of, it seems so paradoxical now, but he was, in fact, he had a good record on civil rights. And he, in 1960, when John Kennedy famously called Coretta King when Martin Luther King was in jail, Nixon didn't do it because he thought it would look like a grandstand play, and he didn't want to be accused of exploiting it. And there's a scene that my old Times colleague Bill Safire tells of witnessing Jackie Robinson leave Nixon's hotel suite in tears, having tried to persuade him, no, it's the right thing to do. And he said, I don't want to look political. And of course, Kennedy did the political thing and got the credit for it. So. And it might have made the difference in places like Illinois. It was widely considered to have been because again, it kind of flew under the radar of the white press. It was seen as a huge gesture in the black community. So important, in fact, that Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King, who had previously made a great point of saying that he couldn't possibly vote for Kennedy because he was a Catholic, said that now, because of his call, he would vote for him. And Kennedy turned to his civil rights advisor, Harris Wofford, and said, could you imagine that? Martin Luther King's father, he has a bigot for a father. And then he took a beat and he said, but we all have our fathers, don't we?
John Kennedy understood about fathers. All right, so a different kind of question. Another fascinating person. I'm so glad that one of our audience members wanted to ask you to tell us about Richard Russell and his role and what was his, and also about his relationship with President Johnson.
Well, Richard Russell was from Georgia. His father had been a justice and then the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. He'd been a governor. He'd come to Washington during the New Deal, and he was a basic supporter of Franklin Roosevelt's rural, electrification and farm aid and school lunches. He was really the father of the modern federal school lunch program, but he was just an implacable segregationist, and it must be said he was also really a hopeless racist. He was raised in an era in which He was taught by his ancestors to believe that the Civil War was a noble lost cause, and in that line of Faulkner's, he could always imagine himself that it wasn't yet 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 3rd, 1863, and Pickett's charge hadn't yet failed, and the Confederacy might prevail. And so he knew the world was changing. He knew he was fighting a losing battle, and he made up his mind that he was going to fight it as hard as he could because he felt that's what he had to do for his constituency. His relationship with President Johnson was incredibly close, very intense. Johnson had made it his business to cozy up to Russell. He called him the old master. And Russell was a very shy and somewhat sad bachelor, but the Johnson family managed to entice him to a lot of Sunday dinners, evening dinners at their house, having had Sam Rayburn for lunch. And he loved their daughters like his own. He gave one of them, Lucy, when she got married, he gave her an autographed copy of Gone with the Wind for her wedding present. But I guess the best thing that you can say about him is that after the filibuster was over and he'd lost and the bill was passed, he stood right up and said, "It's our duty to obey it. It's the law of the land. We have to comply with it, and there'll be no monkey business about trying to have, rearguard action." And I contrast that to. So I mean, he was, not without class.
Yeah. And so fascinating that, so there are 3 Senate office buildings, and one of them's named after Everett Dixon, and one of them's named after Richard Russell.
Exactly.
Yeah. The third one's named after Philip Hart.
Hart of Michigan, exactly,
right,
who was a demon supporter of this bill and then tragically died young, but he was a very strong civil rights supporter.
Excellent. All right, let's find another good question. All right, so this is really a follow-up to something we've been talking about, but it just so I know that people are thinking about, so let me read it. 2 interesting themes resonate with me: politicians who allowed their belief in civil rights to evolve, and the need for bipartisanship. And the question, of course, is, are these dead in today's environment? You live in Washington, D.C., yes?
You don't see, you don't see many examples of it, and you certainly don't see many examples of really political courage in confronting these questions. Or, to put it another way, Bill McCulloch from Ohio, his district was 2.7% black. He just thought it was the right thing to do. The House Republican leader, Charlie Halleck of Indiana, had a similarly all-white district, and he realized his leadership of the caucus would be in jeopardy because he was seen as, imagine this, it's an election year. First of all, 63 running up to the election year, but then 1964 as an election year. And the Republican Party in Congress, instead of saying to President Johnson, "Oh, well, your problem is you have a bunch of hate-filled people in your party and you can't resolve this issue. You have large majorities in both houses, but it's your own fault you can't fix it. Don't blame us. We'll go to the polls and see which party the voters like better." Instead, they removed civil rights as an issue in the election effectively by cooperating to pass the bill. I think it would be hard to believe that their consultants and pollsters and amen chorus of supporters and rooting section would let them do anything like that today. And I think, I often look at Speaker Boehner, and your heart goes out to him because he's a thoroughly decent guy at heart. He wants to do the right thing. If we're up to him, he would have made a lot of deals with President Obama on a lot of topics, I think. But he, as he said on Jay Leno recently, a leader without followers is just a man taking a walk. And I think he doesn't have any interest in taking a walk, much less walking the plank.
Right. Doesn't Halleck lose his leadership?
He does the next year. He loses his leadership seat. In part of this, not because of civil rights narrowly defined, but because they thought he was too high-handed and too willing to cooperate with the Democrats without consulting the party.
So both interesting story of courage, but also some connection to today.
Exactly. And he did, in fact, lose his seat. Lose his leadership role.
So one of the many virtues of the book is you really mastered the arcane rules of the House and the Senate of that period. And we've had a lot of talk about the filibuster lately. Could you tell us a little bit about, compare and contrast on that specific issue about the bipartisanship of politics?
The main difference now is, until very recently at least, whenever anyone threatens a filibuster, and in the current situation with the Democrats in control of the Senate, it's usually the Republicans, everyone collapses in a heap and gives up and says, "We're not even going to try to change your mind." In this case, and a lot of the veteran aides whom I talk to from that era are going nuts when they watch C-SPAN now, because they say that Harry Reid should actually make the opponents conduct a real filibuster and make them hold the floor and let all other business grind to a halt and put pressure on them from the country to say, what are you doing with this idiotic spectacle? Instead of having a kind of, Ziegfeld Follies filibuster like Ted Cruz and Green Eggs and Ham, which isn't really a filibuster at all. It's all by prearrangement and they'll let him do it. But the other thing that I think I did not understand is, in a filibuster, it's not the filibusters who have the burden. They only need to have 3, 4, 5 of them on the floor at any one time to hold the floor. It's the people who are trying to break the filibuster who have the burden, because at any moment someone can call for a quorum, that's saying that, absent of the majority, and they have to produce 51 warm bodies in real time. Which meant they had to set up an elaborate system of on-duty rosters and platoons. People would be ready, to interrupt their dinner or, get out of bed and come in and be present. Because under the rules of the Senate, if a quorum could not be mustered, there are all kinds of arcane procedural things that would kick in, but it would basically reset the clock on the whole debate, giving the Southerners and the filibusters even more time, even more speeches to delay the tactics. So that's partly why Hubert Humphrey and Mike Mansfield knew that running the Senate round the clock would simply exhaust the good guys in their view, and maybe make them willing to compromise with the Southerners in a way that they found not useful. So that's. But I think the huge difference is there aren't really real filibusters anymore. There are these threatened ones, and then everyone just gives up.
You had a great vignette about opening day at the Senators game.
Oh yeah, on April of 1964, they all went to the opening day baseball game, and you would have thought for one day maybe they could just enjoy the national pastime. But Senator Spessard Holland of Florida noted the absence of a quorum, and the loudspeaker went off at the stadium, and 15 senators leapt up out of their seats to go back, and Dick Russell, who was probably the biggest baseball fan in the Senate, close friend of Ty Cobb's, sat there munching his peanuts and having a wonderful time watching the game.
Because he didn't have to
go back. The rest of them had to hustle back.
Yeah. So another question, nuts and bolts question, is great for a historian like me. How many people did you interview, and what types of source materials did you use in writing this book?
I think I probably interviewed something on the order of a couple dozen people, because frankly it was a race against time and death to find some of them.
Could you mention a few?
Well, one of the ones I was especially proud of finding, Dirksen had a crucial legislative aide named Cornelius, a.k.a. Neil Kennedy. And in answer to your other question, I went to a lot of archives around the country, the Kennedy and Johnson Libraries, Congressional Archives, the Minnesota State Historical Society for Hubert Humphrey's papers. But Dirksen's papers are held in Illinois, in his hometown of Pekin, in a wonderful little library that's basically devoted to him and Bob Michael and Ray LaHood. And even the people at the Dirksen Museum, at Mert Dirksen Library, did not know where Neil Kennedy was or whether he was dead or alive. So thanks to the internet and a little bit of creative searching, I found that he was in fact alive at 91, living in Charlottesville, Virginia. He'd suffered a series of very severe strokes which impaired his short-term memory but not his long-term memory. And I went to have a wonderful morning with him, and he was very frail but very clear-eyed and very clear about his memories of the time. So that was great. It was wonderful. And another one, I found a wonderful guy named John Stewart, who worked for Hubert Humphrey. And he and his wife had left Washington in the 70s to go work for the Tennessee Valley Authority in Knoxville. And he's very much alive and still thriving. His son is in the Tennessee legislature. I'm going to see him next week at the Kennedy Library in Boston. And the final one that I found, everyone remembers John Lindsay as the mayor of New York, but when this all was happening, he was the bright young congressman from the Upper East Side, very ambitious, already on the make, going someplace else. And I kept seeing references to a legislative aide of his named Robert Kimball. And my default assumption when I saw these names was usually that the people were dead, because some of them were in their 40s then. And so I just did a Google search of John Lindsay and Robert Kimball, and what came up was this was the Robert Kimball better known to me as the nation's leading historian of the musical comedy theater and the executor and compiler of the complete lyrics of Cole Porter, Ira Gershwin, and so forth and so on, who's very much alive and thriving on the Upper West Side of New York. And I called him, and we had the most wonderful visit. And he started out as a young civil rights lawyer and wound up being this dean of musical theater scholars. And it was, who knew,
Yeah.
So that was.
Boy, that's an interesting.
But all
fact.
because of the internet, all because of the fact that you can, track people down.
Thank you. All right, another question. What was Barry Goldwater's role in opposing the bill, and how did this opposition differ at all, if at all, from Southern Democrats?
His opposition was really rooted in the same kind of libertarian, Western, stay out of my business in my bedroom philosophy that many years later led him to say that he had no objection to gays serving in the military because it didn't matter whether you were straight, it mattered whether you could shoot straight. He was one of only 6 Republicans in the Senate to oppose the bill, and he did so on civil liberties grounds, saying that the interference with private property that the public accommodations section would involve could create a kind of a national police force and a culture of snooping and Big Brother and ratting people out. And I think he was sincere in that. I mean, I don't think he was a racist. But as the final speeches were being made, the New York Times recorded that Everett Dirksen looked at Barry Goldwater right in the eye as if to shame him. But then 2 weeks later, he nominated him at the convention in San Francisco. So it was a paradox that one of the handful of Republicans who opposed the bill became the party's nominee that year.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, another aspect of a momentous change in that period.
yeah, absolutely.
So staying in Arizona, you'll see why I said that. What lesson can immigration reform advocates take away from the passage of the Civil Rights Act?
Well, you know, this is something I've thought about a lot, especially in the last months as I was finishing up the book and thinking about beginning to talk about it with other people. I do wonder why religious groups, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, or even the aspects of the evangelical movement that are very centered on social and economic justice, and there is a big strain in that of, you know, feed the least of us kind of thing. I wonder why they have not coalesced into some kind of broader, more active effort at highlighting immigration as kind of a moral issue and not just an economic and political one. And I think that if there'd be any hope of moving members of Congress on that question, it would be that kind of an effort. And I've been a little bit surprised that nothing like that has happened. And because the other thing that was both depressing and inspiring for me about writing the book was that 50 years ago, you know, we like to think of ourselves as living in a uniquely divisive and uncivil or incivil age. And there's nothing in the meanest internet flame war that could ever be said, and there's nothing that has been said about Barack Obama that wasn't said in some way about John Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or the supporters of civil rights. And it's kind of eerie when you go to the library and you see these people taking the trouble to sit down, women especially, in their perfect Palmer penmanship and, you know, use the N-word and say these hateful things to the president. I found a postcard in the Kennedy Library, a letter, on the night of the March on Washington. That evening, there was postmarked from Huntington, West Virginia, a letter addressed John F. Kennedy, care of Martin Luther King, the White House, Washington, D.C., and the letter read in its entirety, grab the nigger vote, you just lost mine. And I mean, people would actually put this on paper. So I think it's well to remember that we're not the only generation that's suffering with a lack of good manners.
No, thank you. All right, so moving to another body that played a big role in civil rights. So this is a present question, but I also invite you to talk about the Supreme Court in that period. So the question is, now that the Supreme Court has got the Voting Rights Act, I'm sure you've heard this question before, is the Civil Rights Act next?
That question has been asked to me 3 times in the past 36 hours. I think some advocates of civil rights worry that the current court's emphasis, and this morning, the decision on the campaign finance case, that the whole elevation of private property rights and this whole question in the Hobby Lobby case about religious liberty and who would be entitled to withhold service from what groups on what grounds, I think people do worry that some of this body of law is at risk. The problem with the Voting Rights Act comes back again to the dysfunctionality of our current politics. In that case, the court had been warning Congress for years that it needed to do something about addressing and updating this formula. And because the Congress knew that to touch it at all would be to lead to, you know, a tremendous unraveling of, so the Congress punted and got what it deserved in a way, which was this rebuke from the court. But I think it's interesting to hear people like Congressman Lewis and people who were there on the front lines 50 years ago. I think they are very mindful that this fight's an ongoing one, and there has to sort of be constant vigilance. And it's wonderful that there's an African-American president, in their view, but it's not the end of the journey. It's just part of the journey.
Yeah, though, I mean, I think that the Voting Rights Act, the specific provision that was declared unconstitutional was, even more aggressive in terms of its intrusion on states
Yes,
than,
yes.
than the Civil
than
Rights
anything
Act.
in this law was.
Not that our Supreme Court wouldn't find problems with the Civil Rights Act also, but
Yeah.
they're not exactly the same.
They're not exactly parallel, no.
Yeah. Could you talk to us a little bit about if you came across any involvement of Supreme Court justices in this period? So obviously, after the Civil Rights Act of '64 is passed, they have to opine on it, and they do relatively quickly.
Yeah.
So maybe we're going to talk about that. But also, was there, I'm sure you're aware that the presidents and Supreme Court justices talk much more frequently or openly
Yes.
than they do now?
Yes, and played poker and did all
so maybe share with us some
I,
ideas about that.
the thing that, as you pointed out, is that by December of 1964, this court had upheld the public accommodations section, the heart of the law. But I had not realized until I recently read I can commend it because they're nice to me, but there's a very good piece in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly about a series of books, including mine, and another by Bruce Ackerman, a professor of law at Yale. And I did not realize this whole situation there in which Justice Brennan, there was a case pending before the court, and I'm going to get this wrong, but it involved this very question about whether the federal government could apply either the 14th Amendment or the Commerce Clause to the states and to private actors in terms of, and Justice Brennan was afraid that if the court decided the issue, it would create another backlash akin to the backlash that had come with Brown. It would take the heat off Congress to pass a strong law and resolve the issue legislatively. So he, in a wonderful kind of internal process in the court and conference, managed to get them to delay dealing with it long enough that the law was passed in the meantime, and they then didn't have to take action. And if I misdescribe some aspect of that, I cop a plea, but that's basically the outline of what happened. And it's a very interesting window into the fact that the Supreme Court is, in fact, then and now, not a wholly apolitical institution, and certainly a human institution as well.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, a couple more questions. So I asked that one already. I already asked about that one. So I know you're asked this question a lot too, but and you bring it up in your book, so I guess it's fair game to talk about the fact that we have a black president. And I was just reading today an article in the New York Times. There's a big debate going on right now. I'm sure you followed it, about the President Obama's statements towards African Americans, and he's being criticized by some African Americans for being too critical of African Americans. And not asking you to answer that question. I'm just inviting you to talk about where we stand today and how writing this book has made you think differently about where we stand today, having an African American president, and how our politics have changed with regard to race.
Well, I think it has been striking that with the exception of his remarkable speech during the campaign in 2008 about race. That speech was made in this building, wasn't it?
It was.
He's had trouble addressing the question of race as the first black president, in part because he is the first black president. And I have a working theory, hard to prove, that the times when he's gotten into the most trouble have been, as with Skip Gates' case in Cambridge when he criticized the police, or in the Trayvon Martin case when he dared to say that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon. Those are the moments when he faces an enormous firestorm and backlash from particularly the right, but other segments of the country. How dare you say this? How dare you say this? If Bill Clinton had said similar things, he would not have faced the same kind of backlash. So I think President Obama has a singular burden, and he's and certainly his advisors are very conscious of that. So he treads very lightly on this. And it is paradoxical that by his person, he has done so much to elevate the topic, but it's hard for him to talk about it, I think, openly. To me, one of the most remarkable documents of his presidency is, you probably saw pretty early on, a young African-American boy came into the Oval Office, and the president leaned forward so he could touch his hair, and the boy was touching hair that was like his, and that was really a picture that said 1,000 words. It is interesting to me, though, when you ask about that, because in 1963, in the spring of 1963, Robert Kennedy had a meeting with some black intellectuals and artists in New York that is really credited with profoundly affecting his thinking on the question. He went up there, it was convened by James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry was there, Lena Horne, others. And he wanted to make the case that the Kennedy administration was doing more than anyone ever had done. And indeed, it was. And they made the case back to him, but it's not nearly enough. And if this is the best white America can do, it's pretty terrible. And he tried to say to them, but look, 100 years ago, my ancestors came from Ireland and they were completely impoverished, and now my brother's the president. There's no reason at all why you couldn't have a Negro president in 40 years. He was wrong, but only by 5 years.
No, it really is interesting. All right, a couple other questions. So, there are a lot of other things going on in this period. And one of the interesting stories that you tell is how the issues around economic policy, they get entwined but then disentangled with the civil rights issue. So particularly the Tax Act, the tax law that President Kennedy wants to pass. So tell us a little bit about that vignette.
Well, it's interesting. They do get, first of all, I didn't really realize until I started this research how crowded those first 2.5 years of the Kennedy administration were, how cheek by jowl these events were on top of each other, so that the day he made the speech proposing the bill, that morning the University of Alabama had been integrated by James Hood and Vivian Malone, whose sister Sharon is Mrs. Eric Holder. And that night, 4 hours after the speech, Medgar Evers was shot. At the same time the bill was coming to final passage, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner go missing in Mississippi. And LBJ is juggling calls with J. Edgar Hoover about that and members of Congress about the bill. But what you reference is President Kennedy's principal domestic legislative priority was to get a big tax cut, which he thought was going to be an economic stimulus. And in those days, there was a strong caucus in Congress that was fiscally conservative and thought that you should not have a tax cut because you couldn't afford it. And one of the people who was most against that tax cut was Harry Byrd of Virginia, who was a implacable segregationist. So the challenge was to get support from Senator Byrd to move the tax cut along so it could get out of the way, clearing the decks for the civil rights, because Lyndon Johnson knew that if the tax bill was still pending when the debate on the civil rights bill came up, they would be hopelessly entangled, and you'd never make any progress on either one of them, and one would be held hostage to the other. The second point you make, though, is the incompleteness of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the part of the story that is still so unfinished is the economic inequality that persists in America today and that is so racially disparate. And on the day he proposed the bill, President Kennedy cited some statistics about the prospects for a black and white baby born in the same place on the same day. And they involve things like life expectancy, access to college. And on those questions of equality of opportunity, access to opportunity, the lot of blacks is infinitely better today. On the questions of lifetime earning power, wages, it's eerily the same, about half, you know. And so that part of the story is definitely unfinished. And when people talk about, when President Obama talks about the growing inequality gap, that's sort of what, and I suspect next week down in Austin at the LBJ Library, there will be plenty of speakers who are trying to grapple with that very question about, you know, the legacy of work that remains.
Yeah. And of course, Lyndon Johnson did try in the Great Society to address some of those issues. And there's an interesting question, maybe I'm pushing this too far, but it seems an argument could be made that the '64 Act really was a turning point in the 60s, too, that we look at those two periods as distinct.
Yep.
That there's the early 60s that stopped around 1964, and there was common agreement about the Civil Rights Act, even though you proved that there wasn't. And then we get into this other period, which of course the Vietnam War is deeply involved in, but also economic improvement that Lyndon Johnson is trying to create, where we still have lots of disagreements about all of those laws.
Well, and just days after the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, the Watts riots erupt. And so as the 60s go on, these very questions, affirmative action, busing, how do you redress longstanding imbalances? The Civil Rights Act's goal was to be colorblind and to be race neutral. And the thinking was, if you just remove the barriers, people can thrive and talent will out and nature will take its course. And of course, we've seen that that wasn't really true. But it's a triumphant ending to the story in a way, but it's also eerily poignant because it isn't an unalloyed triumph, and it's kind of the last, it's sort of the end of the 50s in a way more than, or I guess the assassination's the end of the 50s, but the '64 Civil Rights Act is the last moment of real national unity on anything. And after that, we get into territory that's much more familiar feeling about the divisions that persist. I think that's true.
Two questions about the people you talked to. So looking back Is that how they look at it? Did you talk about this at all with your interviewees? And I wonder whether they thought about that at the time. It doesn't seem to me that they really, at 1964, why would you be able to envision the future and how this would play out?
I think at the time they were so focused on getting the bill passed and getting the foot in the door. I think they knew that it wouldn't finish the job, and the ardent civil rights supporters knew that there would be other things that would have to be done, but that this would mean you could never go back. You could never backslide all the way. I think it's also clear from the legislative history and from the debates, and Hubert Humphrey at one point says explicitly that nothing in the law should be interpreted as requiring or even allowing quotas in hiring. So I think many people who supported it would not have supported it if they thought it would lead to what we now know as affirmative action. Nick Katzenbach also told me that as much as he would like to think the support for the bill came from moral high purpose and idealism, he thought a great deal of it came from the practical hopes of members of Congress that passing the bill would stop the demonstrations and stop the disorder in the streets. And of course, the disorder in the streets got worse. So that's part of it. But I was moved in talking to people, many of whom are now, have had rich, full, long lives of doing other things. When they talk about this, they get a certain tone in their voice, and they knew that then, and they are proud now that they were living in really amazing times.
Yeah. Well, so it's just wonderful that you were able to capture that. And again, I want to thank you for this conversation and thank you for that book. I think that leaves us with at least a little optimism that maybe this could happen again, that moment that you captured.
Well, we got through the Civil War, so we're still hanging in here. So, and as Dr. Franklin said on the steps just across the street, the lady who supposedly asked him, "What have you given us?" A republic, if you can keep it. So it's really our job to keep it. So
good. That's very good. So Todd is available for book signings right over here, and I invite you to spend a little time with him and pick up this wonderful book. Thanks again.
Thanks
Todd.
so much, Wendell. Should we